Welcome to Inside Scoop Live, the podcast where indie authors get personal, sharing insights about their books, their writing journeys, and their passions. I'm your host, Sherry Hoyt, and I invite you to join me for engaging conversations with both debut indie authors and seasoned veterans. Whether you're looking for your next great read or a bit of inspiration, you've come to the right place. Let's get started. Hi, everyone. Hal Emerson is here today to talk about his latest book, Cicero James' Miracle Worker. It's a sharp, character-driven urban fantasy that blends dry humor, supernatural suspense, and emotional depth in a vividly reimagined San Francisco. Before we get started, here's the inside scoop on the author. Hal Emerson is the author of 10 books, including the award-winning Exile trilogy, beginning with The Prince of Ravens. He is a graduate of UCLA with a BA in theater, where he studied Shakespeare, Chekhov, and the Greek and Roman classics. He also has an MBA from UC Berkeley. Some of his favorite books and series include East of Eden, The Brothers Karamazov, The Lord of the Rings, and The Wheel of Time. As a young reader, he was particularly inspired by the Chronicles of Prydain, and he is an avid Harry Potter fan. He still believes in the Oxford comma, and he has seen every Robin Williams movie. To learn more about Hal Emerson and his work, visit his website at halemerson.com. Well, hi, Hal. Welcome to Inside Scoop Live.
Thanks very much.
Absolutely. Looking forward to learning more about you and your book. I guess to get us started, why don't you tell us a little bit about Cicero James' Miracle Worker? What's the story about? And what was your inspiration behind the story?
Yeah, sure. So Cicero James, it's the story of, as the title suggests, a modern miracle worker living in San Francisco. He's part of a parallel society of workers, and he specializes as a freelance worker who mends cracks in reality. Particularly, he focuses on what in the book are called terrors, which are things that feed off of people's fears and basically come through into our reality and wreak havoc. So, generally speaking, are things that attach to people based on their beliefs and get pulled into reality and given life, and that he then has to go deal with.
Oh, wow. So like a blend of grounded reality with the surreal.
Yeah, kind of a magical realism version of urban fantasy. So definitely grounded in the real San Francisco, which is close to where I live, and taking that as the starting place, but then introducing a lot of modern fantasy elements into it as well.
Okay, great. Yeah. Now, the line where Cicero admits, like right in the beginning, he's died multiple times. How does that
Yes.
kind of set the stage for everything that follows?
I actually came up with that line, I want to say 10 years ago. I was at a friend's wedding and we were talking about something or other around some urban fantasy story about vampires or things like that. And there was a joke that one of my friends made about how they felt like the most exciting part of a lot of those stories was always when one of the characters comes back alive. And, in a TV show or a movie, you'll see it and there'll be like a big music blast at the same time as a surprise. And so I kind of ran with that joke at the time and said, it would be interesting if it wasn't just the first time it had happened. He was just like relaying that, hey, this happened to me last week and it's kind of normal now and I got to tell you about it. So I came up with a line, like I said, about 10 years ago now. Yeah, I've been just kind of trying to think of what the story would be around it. And that came a lot later. I tried to write a draft of it years and years ago and it just didn't work. So I put it away on a shelf for a while and I wrote some other books. And yeah, just recently came back to this one about a year ago, and whatever, waiting I had done had let it build up enough in my subconscious that it all came out, which was good.
Yeah, I love that. You built a story around this line. I died last week and it's happened before. I love that.
Yeah.
I mean, it kind of tells the audience right then and there, kind of buckle up. This is going to be different.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now, Cicero's voice is sharp, is self-aware, emotionally honest. How does that kind of shape the story and what it reveals about him?
Sure. Yeah. So I've written a number of epic fantasy novels. I've written a couple sci-fis, and I started writing it in the third person because that was where I was used to writing. But then I kept coming back to the line, and it became more impactful when it was written in the first person.
Mm,
And just the way that the line is laid out of like, it's very brusque. It's very, hey, here's the thing I got to tell you. It kind of informed the character just from the line itself and going from there, expanding on who this person had to be to talk like this, to be this frank. Why did they need to be this frank? Why did this person need to tell us about this stuff? And I'd always wanted to have some kind of urban fantasy world that was parallel. I've always enjoyed, stories like that, the whole like Jim Butcher stories or Neil Gaiman stories, which are parallel worlds I've always enjoyed, and I'd never written one.
Yeah.
And like I said, it all kind of came out of that line. And so the line informed the character. And from there, it just became kind of a logic exercise of who does this person need to be? What does the world need to be to justify that person being real? And
Mm.
going from there.
Tell us about Cicero's tattoos. What do they tell
Okay.
us about identity, control, and the way his powers work?
Yeah, certainly. So I actually read when I was younger, and I've loved it ever since. It's a Ray Bradbury book, Something Wicked This Way Comes.
Mm.
And there was an illustrated man in it, and I loved how he was treated in that book, and like the tattoos kind of coming to life and things like that. So I'd had that idea in the back of my head for a long time, and I didn't want to do the typical thing that fantasy has, which is you kind of have to rely on a wizard's staff or a witch's a wand or things like that, some of which I do adapt into the book in other ways, but I wanted to do something a little bit unique. And so I tried to be unique with the magic system overall, but I thought that one interesting thing would be to I love quotes. I don't personally have any tattoos, which I've told a few people and they were disappointed, unfortunately. And um, but I've always liked the idea of if I were to get a tattoo, I've thought about getting quotes of things that I've really enjoyed. I've done a decent amount of Shakespeare, actually acting as well as just reading, and I've always enjoyed that. I've always enjoyed Emerson, which is Hal Emerson, part of where that comes from. And so I took a bunch of the quotes that I enjoyed, and I thought, well, what if you turn some of these into like what would these do if they were magic spells, right? If it was just because the whole conceit of the miracle worker society is it's not necessarily important what you believe. It's just important that you believe it. And if you believe it, it becomes real. And that's how the magic system works of it can be different for each person. So each person has a slightly different conduit that they'll channel things through. And for Cicero, it became, well, what if it was words? And what if he was writing this because he was the one who was best with words? And what if his magic came from having words tattooed on himself that he invested with a belief that it would do something?
Mm.
And that was where the idea for the tattoos came from. And I originally just had two. I just had one kind of on each arm that he would do things with. And then from there, I think I ended up with, I've got like a list of 20 that I kind of picked and I narrowed down to about nine. And just enjoy the idea of, okay, what would each of these things do? And that was kind of a fun intellectual exercise for me.
So the tattoos themselves are a power source?
Yeah, more so they're kind of imbued with power when he gets them. Like it's a quote that means something to him for some reason, and then he can kind of fix it in his mind of, I can believe this thing means a thing, so that when he activates it, that thing happens and it happens quickly.
Wow. Okay. Literally.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So one of them's a Shakespeare quote, I know. Tell us about a couple of the others.
Yeah, several of them are Shakespeare, and there's a Douglas Adams quote. Yeah, there's a few that, and again, like I said, I came up with like 20, maybe even 25, and I narrowed them down because I knew when I needed him to use them, like narratively in the story, and so I just kind
Yeah.
of had to pick ones that ended up fitting with like, okay, got to do this somehow to get out of this scrape in this way, so it's got to be this quote. But yeah, several of them are Shakespeare, and then there's like I said, Douglas Adams quote, and then there's a few more that I'm forgetting off the top of my head. I think there's an Emerson quote in there as well.
Yeah. I love that. It's very original. Yeah.
Thank you.
Tell me about Cicero's sense of humor. What does that reveal about how he navigates danger, loss, responsibility? How does he use humor?
Yeah, definitely. It's similar to how I, as a person, use humor. It's funny because I'll only use it with people who are close to me because I have a dark sense of humor sometimes. I have always thought that it's kind of nice to laugh at things to process them. Once you've gotten through, whatever first initial emotional reaction you have, I enjoy finding the humor in things to try to lighten something, even when it's very dark. And again, coming back to that original line, and I think why it stuck with me all these years of there's some being something almost like a dry wit to it already of like, hey, I died. I got to tell you about it. So
Yeah.
already you're getting this like, hey, there's this really important thing that happened, but we got to talk about it now. So it's kind of how does this character take dark things and make them relatable? And for me, that's always been humor. So that was what I went with.
Okay. Is it kind of like self-deprecating or
Uh,
not?
Definitely sometimes. I think that
Okay.
it's a defense mechanism for sure. And
Yeah.
then as part of that, sometimes it's self-deprecating. That being said, there's interactions with other characters throughout the book. Like one of the interactions he has with Corey, who's one of the other characters. she gives him some of his like kind of sass back to his face, and he has a negative reaction to that. So he likes being the clever, the funny one. And didn't actually plan that, but then I introduced the character of Corey, and kind of it just came out on the page of him reacting negatively, and then she reacting to him, and that became interesting. So she actually became a bigger character than I originally intended, partly because I just enjoyed the fact that they were bickering with each other, which, like I said, I hadn't intended.
Right, right. I love when characters kind of take the narrative and run with it in a direction you might not have intended. It's magic.
Yeah, definitely.
Now, we see different sides of Cicero through his relationships, especially with Marlowe, Rock, and
Mhm.
the Blissful. Which of those brings out the most honest version of him?
Yeah, that's a good question. I do my best to try to make people as similar to real life people as I can. And I think that, like a lot of us, we are an honest version of ourselves, just a different version with different people. And I think that
Mm,
Marlowe has been his mentor, and not to get too into the backstory, but like basically a substitute father figure in his life. So that's an honest relationship just because Marlowe has known him the longest and has seen him grow from being a teenager into being a young man. So there's an honesty there that he doesn't have with the other characters. But I also think that the blissful is the name that I gave to basically people who aren't magical. They're blissfully unaware, which is kind of where the conceit of the name comes from. And the fact that Cicero is paid by the workers, or the miracle workers, and the workers guild to go fix cracks in reality. And he cares a lot about fixing things. He cares a lot about taking care of problems that other people won't take care of, partly
mhm.
because of his, personal backstory and things like that. So I definitely think there's an honesty to a softness to him, or like a caring compassion to him, that only comes out when he's interacting with people who aren't workers like him. It's the blissful who don't even know he exists, and he wants to fix things for them because they can't do it themselves. And yes, he's getting paid for it, but honestly, he'd probably do it even if he weren't getting paid for it, because
Mm,
it allows him to scratch that itch. So I think he's probably more honest than he should be. He's just honest in different ways with different people.
right, right. Tell us about the workings. Who are they? What do they do? And why do they matter in the story?
Yeah, sure. So the workings themselves are basically the name that I used for spells, because I was again trying to think of, okay, what's a way not to use the word magic or the word sorcery, or like, how do I do something that's kind of like a vampire, but not actually a vampire? Like, how do you kind of elevate some of these tropes that have been used so frequently? How do you do other
Right.
things with them? So I would use the word working or worker to be like magic or magician, sorcerer. And Cicero is a worker, right, which is just short for miracle worker, but no one uses the miracle part anymore because it's considered, outdated, and no one talks that way anymore. So they all call themselves workers, right, which is, other witches and wizards basically in the modern world. But part of that conceit is that they have a guild, right? They have a union basically that's like regulates what they can and can't do. They have a government that enforces certain laws. So I liked using the word worker because it implies, it's almost like a blue collar job in this world of,
Yeah.
he doesn't make a huge amount of money. He gets paid by the job. He never really makes enough, but he's got enough that he's got a place, an apartment and a place in the society. So yeah, the other workers, of which there aren't many, but decent enough number that there's somewhat of a society that he is part of, and they live in the real world, but they also have a parallel society that they can go to, that they can be themselves in.
Wow. Okay. How fun was this creating this world?
It was a lot of fun. It was, like I mentioned earlier, I've written a number of epic fantasy novels, and that was fun because you get to generate a world entirely out of nothing. We're not out of nothing, entirely, right? But
Yeah.
generally, you're creating like a continent that's not a real continent, and you're putting people on it who aren't real people, and all this kind of stuff. In urban fantasy, I actually found myself really enjoying coming up with excuses as to why no one has noticed that there's this parallel world. Again, a kind of fun conceit or trope of the genre is that if there's a parallel world, why are we as regularly blissful people not noticing it? And that was a lot of fun to come up with, of not just the magic system and how all this works, but why don't regular people know about it, and why haven't they noticed it? But how does it still seamlessly fit into the world and the universe that we all inhabit? And that was a really fun creative exercise.
Yeah. Yeah. Sounds like it. So we talked about the blissful, the workings, the workers, and you mentioned the terrors a little bit earlier. Tell us a little bit about them. they're monsters? What did they reveal about how belief kind of shapes reality in that world?
Yeah, yeah, great question. So they are definitely in the incarnation in which they appear in this book, and this is the first book of kind of a planned series, but the way that I intentionally wrote this one, terrors are an incarnation of people's fear. So they're not the only kind of monster or creature that can be pulled into the what we would, call the real world. There's also things called the wrathful or the envious, right? Things that are kind of feeding off of different, you'd think of negative emotions or things like that that can be taken and twisted and turned into something.
Mm,
And the idea is that if someone is basically has attached a negative belief to something that is involving fear or some kind of deep-seated emotional challenge that they have, and they happen to do it strongly enough, they can actually create a crack in reality. And a force will come through from the space beyond reality and will start to inhabit those fears, or, yeah, in the case of a terror, inhabit the fears and build and build and build and become the monster that you didn't originally have in the world, but that you've created because of your belief in it. You have created this monster by bringing it in and ruminating on it and feeding it basically with all your thoughts and negative emotions. So then, because it is fed, it grows and it becomes so big that it can't be dealt with in a normal way. And so that's when you need someone like Cicero or another worker to come in to actually get rid of and dispel the terror and mend the crack in reality so that everyone can go back to regular life. And
mm,
like I mentioned, the terrors aren't the only kind of creatures there are. So, people who are overly angry would pull in one of the wrathful, and there's different, ways that a wrathful would manifest versus a terror. And all these things, they will look differently for each person who brings one in. So in the book, the terror that's brought in is definitely a monster, and it's very much a demon shape. And I wanted to start there because that's kind of something that people can associate easily with. Okay, got it. Monster, evil, demon-looking thing. Great. I understand kind of what this is. Uh, but it could be different based on different things. Like for some people, it could be some kind of monstrous version of a snake, and so instead of a demon, or it could be a monstrous version of a person, right? If they're investing too much in someone that is no longer there, it could be some kind of like ghost or apparition that would create a haunting. So trying to again find a way to tie all these things together across urban fantasy stories where there's like ghosts and all these kind of things, but not calling it that, not calling it a demon, kind of
yeah.
taking it a step beyond, I would hope, or elevating it a little bit and saying, what do a lot of these things have in common is it's something that's pulled into reality based on some kind of connection or some kind of negative experience that's really taken over a person or a place or a location.
Wow, that's amazing because we take our emotions and we build them up and build them up and build them
Yeah.
up no matter what they are. And so, I mean, they do kind of become monster like or, whatever emotion
Yeah,
you're
they
talking
certainly
about.
can.
So, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Wow, very interesting. So, how do Cicero's struggles with mental health shape his role as a worker and a protector of the blissful?
Definitely. So one of the another of the conceits again of like, okay, why are there workers versus regular people? Kind of what
Mm,
makes a worker different than everyone else? And one of the tropes that I've enjoyed about urban fantasy, but about other stories generally as well, is taking something that seems like it should have broken you when you were younger, like something that happened to you that was very formative, and turning it into something that is beneficial. So the idea is that a lot of all the workers really have some kind of break that happens to them in the transition from childhood to teenage years, so somewhere around 10, 11, right? And that allows them to see the world in a different way so that the rest of us basically grow up and we don't have that trauma so that we don't have to question reality. They
right.
have something happen to them that's so intense that they question reality, and from there they all of a sudden can start to play with it. They can start to do things that other people can't because something so intense has happened to them that they actually have to look at the world and see where it is broken and where it might be able to be fixed.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
yeah, so I found that a really interesting way of generating powers, but also, differentiating that you're blissful from workers.
Right. Not PTSD, but almost.
Could be.
Yeah.
Yeah, in the conception of it, it would manifest differently for each worker. Like everyone's going to have a different experience that happened to them that kind of created that break that they have to work through. and then they go to kind of worker training to get through it, and then on the other side they're able to do these miracles.
Mm,
um, but yeah, definitely, could be, post-traumatic stress disorder or other things. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. How do the shifts between like the fast-paced action and then the quiet reflection reflect Cicero's internal conflict?
Yeah, I think that one of the original ideas that I had for this was that Cicero would be telling the story and need to tell it quickly for some reason. Like for some reason, it was going to be important that he tell this to people that
Mm,
wouldn't otherwise know it, and then that lended itself to there's a lot of action, a lot of things are happening, and then he has to take a step back and say, "Hey, let's just make sure that you understood all that, and here's what's important, and now we can go back into the action again." So kind of inherent from the very first chapter that I wrote was that there would be this split or this dichotomy between we've got kind of the frame narrative, which is I have to tell you this story and I'll occasionally make comments on it and all this kind of stuff, which also allows us to question, is he a reliable narrator? Is he not? And then inside the frame narrative is the actual narrative of what happened and switching back and forth. So I've enjoyed stories that do that. I like having some kind of narrator on top of it when something is told from first person. So baking that in from the beginning was important to me.
right, right. Kinda talking to the reader too, not just telling the
Yeah.
story, but yeah, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And I liked that kind of a direct address. I wanted that to be part of it from very early on.
Right, right. So, you talked a little bit about humor. Why is the humor so important to how this story resonates with readers and even when the stakes are high?
Yeah, I think humor makes it easier to accept some of the crazier things and some of the crazier stakes, and to help with some of the kind of necessary exposition dumping that you have to do of like, hey, here's this massive amount of information that I gotta tell you about to like inform the rest of this story because this is a world that you're not familiar with. And so it helps with that certainly because you can kind of make a joke about that and say, hey, like if you don't care, that's all right. Just skip to the next page. You can finish the rest of the story. So partly that direct address makes it easy, but then also the humor of the direct address of kind of acknowledging the absurdity, very similar to maybe a lot of things or hobbies that we participate in and trying to explain it to someone who's never done that thing before,
Mm,
and realizing kind of how bizarre some of this stuff might sound if you're trying to explain like D&D, Dungeons and Dragons to someone for the first time, or even trying to like explain how to play, football. It's like, and then there's the goals and there's this thing, and you know what? It doesn't matter. Let's just play the game. So
right,
that kind of humor I thought was important to help keep people engaged throughout, so that they didn't, kind of fall off along the way.
right, right. Does the name Cicero James carry any special meaning or context within the world that you created?
I originally came up with Cicero because of the tattoos, actually, and I liked the idea that it was going to be someone who, like didn't, want to acknowledge kind of the inheritance of that name. So like, he wants people to call him James or CJ occasionally, but like only very rarely does he let people call him Cicero.
Mm,
But that name came from because he's got these tattoos and he's got this affinity for words, and he's the one who's writing this, right? He's kind of the one who's been tasked to tell everyone about this story. So the idea being that he is not like a modern incarnation of Cicero or anything like that, but someone who is an orator or someone who is good with words and connected to words. And I wanted to have that in his name. And then James, I just wanted to be a contrast. So Cicero was the thing that mattered most, but then James, I wanted something that was, kind of strong, but also not generic, I guess, but common, right? It's like Cicero is less common. There's definitely someone you think of when you think of that. And then James is kind of like, oh, I know James, Jim,
y
all this kind of stuff. So more of a contrast.
yeah, yeah, okay. Is there anything in particular that you hope readers take away from Cicero's journey?
Oh, that's a good question. I try not to moralize too much. I put a lot of kind of my thoughts and feelings into the character's actions, but I do think kind of the underlying substrate of a lot of this is be careful what you believe because your belief in that thing, if it's negative, can overpower you, and also
Mhm,
your belief in a thing, if it's positive, can create something beautiful as well, because the magic structure is all based on order and chaos. So you can get power from chaos. It's kind of quick fast food version of power. Like you break something, you destroy something sacred, you create chaos in the world, and that'll give you power to generate or to do things, to work in the world. But you could also create something beautiful. You can put some order into the world. You can create structure. You can sculpt something. and kind of similar to like fission versus fusion of like that's actually the more powerful thing is to put order into the world, but it takes more time, it takes more effort, and setting that up intentionally. And you can use both, and a lot of people, good people, use both. But people who do more of the order stuff are bringing that into the world and helping others. And that was definitely one of the things that I enjoyed putting in there. So I hope people enjoy that as well.
Yeah, I'm interested in the kind of feedback you have received so far. Has
Mm.
anyone interpreted the story in a way that surprised you or made you look at it differently?
I don't think necessarily surprised me. I think that the immediate answer is that there's some people who read, in the times we're in, people who read political messages into things that, I wasn't intending anything to be political one way or the other, but
Mm,
definitely with the you get secret conspiracy theories and all this kind of stuff in a world that you've written and built and everything. So sometimes I get feedback from it's very interesting to see it kind of come from both sides of the aisle of feeling like people are represented in struggles that are written on the page. So that I
yeah.
think if I had to pick a surprising thing, I think maybe I wasn't too surprised, but it was definitely I got some of that, which was not my intention. But it's still nice to have people relating to the book.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Unfortunately, I think we can bring politics into everything these
Yeah,
days.
yeah.
Oh,
Unfortunately.
yeah. So you mentioned this was going to be part of a series. So what's next for you? Are you working on the next book now? And can you tell us anything about it?
I am. Yeah, the next book is in the works. The first book basically takes place over the course of like roughly a week span. The second book is set basically a week after the first book ends and is going to take place over a few more weeks. Now that I've got the first one written and I've done basically kind of market research of how it's being received, what people like, what people didn't, I'll probably write a few more fairly quickly because I have intended the series to take place over like the course of a few months, kind of leading up to a quick resolution in terms of the time span of the book series. So
Yeah.
the next book will take place, a week or so after and the end of the first book, and it will be the logical next steps of what has to happen now that a few new bad guys have been revealed, some new allies, and where everyone has to take things next.
Okay. Okay. Having built the world in the first book, I imagine the subsequent books will maybe you'll write them faster or be able to write them
Yeah,
faster.
definitely,
Okay.
definitely. Yeah, and like I mentioned, I took a bit of a pause just to make sure that I digested the feedback, which has been so far quite good, which is great. And so just making sure that I know kind of what people enjoyed, what people didn't, and making sure I'm leaning into the things that are good and also making sure that I'm, clarifying anything that wasn't clear to people in the first book and yeah, just further expanding on things, which is exciting.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Hal, is there anything you wanted to add today?
No, I'm just glad people are enjoying it. I think, at the end of the day, I can write anything that I want, but if no one's reading it, if no one's enjoying it, then that's the other half of the equation. So I'm excited people are picking it up, and I hope that they stick around for the second, third, and we'll see how many more come after that.
All right. All right. Well, Hal, thank you so much for joining me today and sharing a little bit about you and your work.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks for your time, Sherry.
Thank you so much for joining me today for my interview with Hal Emerson, author of Cicero James' Miracle Worker. You can learn more about Hal and his work at halemerson.com. And be sure to check out our other interviews at InsideScoopLive.com.